The HOA thought they could bully one farmer into submission, but they didn't know he was the director of the FAA, and he was about to bring their dream crashing down. The sound of bulldozers wasn't supposed to echo through the fields of Durham County, North Carolina, that morning. Yet there it was, engines growling, metal teeth clawing into the earth, as if the land had no story to tell. The construction crew wore bright neon vests and heavy boots, following the instructions of a project they barely understood. To them, it was just another job, another check to cash. But to Cornell Braxton, watching from the edge of his soybean field, it felt like someone had shoved a knife straight into the chest of his family's history. Cornell didn't raise his voice right away. He didn't need to. The man had a presence about him, the kind that made you notice even when he said nothing. At 6 feet tall, with shoulders built from years of farm work, he stood there in worn jeans and a faded work shirt, gripping the brim of his cap as if it were the only thing keeping him calm. His father's old barn sat just behind him, weathered but standing strong. That land wasn't just dirt. It carried the weight of 3 generations, each acre a chapter of struggle, pride, and survival. A foreman spotted him and waved. "Morning, sir. Just a heads up, we'll be clearing a strip right through here." Gave us the green light. Cornell's eyes narrowed. His voice came out steady, measured, but sharp. "This isn't HOA property, this is my farm. You're trespassing." The man hesitated, glancing back at the heavy equipment already grinding forward. "I don't make the rules. Talk to your board, we've got the permits. Permits don't mean a thing if they're built on stolen ground." Cornell replied, his voice carrying over the roar of the machines. By then, his sister Rosalind, who lived in a small house near the southern fence line, had hurried over. She had flour dust on her apron, her hands still sticky from the bread dough she'd left on the counter. "Cornell, what on earth is happening?" "They think they can put a runway through Braxton land," he said flatly. Rosalind stared in disbelief, her jaw tightening as she turned toward the machines tearing into the soil. "They've lost their minds." The foreman shifted uncomfortably, lowering his voice as though trying to reason with Cornell. "Look, sir, I've got orders. If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA president. Geraldine Klein, she signed off on this." "I can't stop the work." Cornell took a long breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't shout, didn't storm, didn't throw a fit. Instead, he walked past the foreman, straight toward the bulldozer operator, and raised his hand. The man in the cab looked confused, until Cornell locked eyes with him. With nothing more than that look, the engine cut off. Silence swept across the field like a curtain dropping after a chaotic scene, not one more inch. Cornell said. The crew stood frozen, waiting for someone else to decide what came next. They were used to angry homeowners waving papers and shouting threats. They weren't used to a man who carried himself like Cornell Braxton. By then, a few neighbors had gathered near the property line, curiosity drawing them from their morning routines. Some whispered about the project, about how the HOA promised a private airstrip would elevate property values and attract the kind of neighbors Maplewood Lakes wanted. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing exactly whose land was being cut apart. Rosalind tugged on her brother's sleeve. "Cornell, you need to handle this through the county. Don't give them a reason to twist this against you." "I'll handle it," he answered. His tone was calm, but his eyes burned with resolve. What none of the crew, none of the gawking neighbors, and not even his sister knew at that moment, was the other life Cornell lived. Farming was his grounding, his roots. But during the week, he wasn't just tending crops. He was on planes to Washington, D.C., sitting in a federal office with decisions that shaped the very skies above the country. Cornell Braxton was the director of the Federal Aviation Administration. And here was an HOA tearing a scar across his land for a runway that would never fly without his say-so. The air felt heavy with tension as Geraldine Klein's black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the field. She stepped out in heels that sank into the dirt, her sunglasses catching the morning sun. With her came the sharp scent of perfume, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of churned soil. "Mr. Braxton," she called out, striding toward him as though the land already belonged to her. "I see you've met the crew. You'll be glad to know this project is going to raise everyone's property values. It's progress, Cornell didn't move, didn't flinch. You mean it's theft? This ground isn't HOA property. It's mine. Geraldine gave a rehearsed smile, the kind you use when you're certain you've already won. Our records show otherwise. And the board approved it unanimously. You'll find that resistance will only make things harder for you in the long run. Rosalind gasped softly. Harder for him? Geraldine, you're bulldozing family land. Geraldine didn't even look at her. She kept her eyes locked on Cornell. Cornell studied her for a long moment before finally replying, You've built your fight on the wrong runway. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the machines could make. For the first time, Geraldine's smile flickered. She couldn't have known that the man standing in front of her was the very person who could make her project crash before it ever took off. But the battle wasn't just about land anymore. It was about pride, power, and a collision course no one in Maplewood Lakes could avoid. Cornell Braxton didn't head back inside right away after the confrontation. He stood at the edge of his field long after the bulldozers had gone silent, the grooves in the soil marking where strangers had carved into his family's history. The sun was climbing higher, burning away the morning haze, but his mind was already shifting gears. For anyone else, this would have been a property dispute. For him, it was something larger, something layered. Later that evening, as the crickets began their chorus, Cornell sat at the worn oak table in his farmhouse kitchen. The smell of Rosalind's bread still lingered in the air, faint but comforting. Across from him sat his wife, Patrice, who had spent the day in Raleigh teaching history to middle school students. She placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, watching his face carefully. You didn't tell them who you are, did you? Patrice asked. Cornell shook his head. No. That part comes later. You sure about that? She leaned on her elbows, her voice low. You're the FAA director, Cornell. You could have shut it down on the spot. That's not how this works, he replied, rubbing the calluses on his palms. This isn't about throwing weight around. It's about respect. They need to learn that first. Their son, Anthony, a 22-year-old college student home for the summer, sat in the corner scrolling his phone. Dad, they don't care about respect. HOA folks like that, they think they own the county. Mom's right, you could end this tomorrow if you wanted to. Cornell gave a small smile, but didn't look up. Anthony, sometimes the loudest power isn't the one you throw on the table. It's the one you keep in your back pocket until the right moment. Anthony rolled his eyes. Sounds like you're letting them push you around. Patrice shot her son a look, but Cornell didn't take offense. He'd heard worse during tense hearings in D.C. He looked directly at Anthony. Son, let me ask you something. If you fight every battle with a hammer, what happens when you come across a problem that needs a scalpel? You'll wreck the whole thing. Sometimes you wait. Sometimes you let them show you just how reckless they are. That way, when you strike, it's clean. The room fell quiet for a moment. Anthony nodded slowly, the lesson sinking in, even if he didn't want to admit it. Patrice reached across the table and touched Cornell's hand. I just don't want them dragging your name into the mud. They'll twist this however they can. Cornell squeezed her hand back. They've already started digging into mud. They just don't know whose land they're sinking into. The next morning, Cornell was gone before sunrise, heading toward Raleigh-Durham International Airport to catch his flight to D.C. He carried a simple duffel bag. No suits, no fanfare, just a man going to work. But behind the wheel, his mind ran through the countless policy briefings, aviation safety reports, and federal approvals sitting on his desk in Washington. He thought about how small Geraldine Klein's runway dream would look under the cold scrutiny of federal law. By noon, he was seated at his office in the FAA headquarters. The room was modern, with tall glass windows overlooking the Capitol. Staffers came and went with folders, updates, and urgent memos. Cornell listened carefully, spoke with precision, and carried the same quiet authority he had back on the farm. To his colleagues, he was Director Braxton, the man who shaped air travel policy for an entire nation. At one point during the day, his deputy, Franklin Yates, leaned into his office. Sir, you've got the Aviation Committee briefing at 3. You ready? Cornell closed a folder and looked up. Franklin, I was born ready. But let me ask you something. What's the FAA's stance on unapproved private runways built over disputed land? Franklin blinked, caught off guard by the oddly specific question. Illegal, plain and simple. You need clearances, environmental studies, land ownership proof. Why do you ask? Cornell gave a faint smile, one only his closest staff recognized. Let's just say I have a personal interest in how the rules are applied. Back in Maplewood Lakes, Geraldine Klein gathered with her board members at the HOA clubhouse, a polished building with stone columns and manicured hedges. She sipped from a glass of sparkling water as she addressed the room. Neighbors, the runway project is moving forward. Don't let Braxton scare you. He's just one man standing in the way of progress. We've dealt with stubborn landowners before. One of the younger board members, Travis Merriman, shifted uncomfortably. Geraldine, with all due respect, Braxton isn't just any landowner. Folks say he's got pull beyond this county. What if he takes this to court? Geraldine waved her hand dismissively. Courts take years. By then the runway will already be functional. People will thank us when their property values double. Trust me. But whispers were spreading in the community. At the grocery store, at church, even outside the elementary school, neighbors questioned whether Geraldine had gone too far this time. The Braxton name carried weight, not just for their land, but for their dignity. People remembered how Cornell's father had fought to keep the farm during tough economic downturns. They remembered Rosalind teaching kids in Sunday school. And they remembered that Cornell himself, though private, was no ordinary man. But Geraldine wasn't backing down, and the storm gathering over Maplewood Lakes was about to get louder. By the end of that week, the lines in Maplewood Lakes had been drawn. The HOA board wasn't just pressing forward, they were accelerating. Construction crews came back with survey equipment and more trucks, ignoring the quiet stares of neighbors who had started gathering at the edge of the fields. The Braxton farm had turned into a spectacle, a place where whispers carried louder than the roar of the machines. On Saturday morning, the HOA held a special meeting in the clubhouse. Flyers had been shoved into mailboxes, urging residents to attend and support the vision for Maplewood Lakes. By noon, the place was packed. Retirees in polo shirts, young couples with restless toddlers, and longtime residents all filled the rows of folding chairs. At the front of the room, Geraldine Klein stood behind the podium in her sharp navy suit, her hair pulled back tight. She carried herself like she was running a campaign, not managing a neighborhood dispute. Beside her sat two board members, Travis Merriman and Evelyn Rhodes, both looking less confident than their leader. Geraldine tapped the microphone. Thank you, everyone, for coming on such short notice. We're here to address concerns about the runway project and to reassure you that everything is moving ahead as planned. This development will raise property values, attract high-quality residents, and bring Maplewood Lakes into the future. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man in the back raised his hand. And whose land are you plowing through for this future? Because last I checked, that farm belongs to the Braxton family. Geraldine's smile tightened. The land in question falls under Maplewood Lakes jurisdiction. Records show it was improperly filed years ago. Our board's approval makes the development legitimate. From the middle row, a woman named Joanne Fields, who'd lived in the community for 20 years, stood up. That's nonsense, Geraldine. Everyone in this county knows that land belongs to Cornell. His daddy worked it before him, and his grandfather before that. How dare you say it's yours to take? Geraldine leaned forward, her voice taking on a clipped tone. Joanne, emotion doesn't change facts. The Braxton family has been allowed to use the land out of courtesy, but legal jurisdiction rests with Maplewood Lakes. The board has approved the project. End of discussion. That's when the back doors opened, and Cornell himself walked in. He didn't make an entrance. He simply stepped inside wearing his work clothes, his cap tucked under his arm. The room fell into a hush as he crossed the floor and took an empty chair in the front row. Geraldine's eyes narrowed. Mr. Braxton, we weren't expecting you. Cornell's voice was calm, but it carried. I wasn't expecting bulldozers on my land either. Yet here we are. The room stirred with whispers. Geraldine cleared her throat and gestured toward the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what I mean. progress comes with resistance. We cannot let one person stand in the way of what benefits everyone. Cornell leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. That's the thing, Geraldine. You keep saying everyone, but when you talk about progress, you mean profit for a few and destruction for the rest. My family's land isn't a bargaining chip for your ambitions. Travis Merriman shifted in his chair beside Geraldine, clearly uncomfortable. He spoke up, his voice uncertain. Maybe we should slow down, Geraldine. People are upset. The Braxtons have a rightful claim. Geraldine cut him off with a glare. Travis, the board voted unanimously. You agreed. Don't backpedal now. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Cornell stood slowly, his voice measured, but unmistakably firm. You've mistaken my patience for weakness. Let me make this clear. The land is not yours, and every inch of dirt you tear up is one more inch you'll answer for. The crowd broke into low chatter. Some nodded at Cornell's words, others exchanged worried glances. Families didn't move into Maplewood Lakes to end up in lawsuits, and the thought of being dragged into a federal mess made them uneasy. One older resident, Howard Greer, lifted his cane and pointed it toward the podium. Geraldine, you've gone too far this time. I've paid HOA dues for 20 years, and never once have I seen you run roughshod over a man's property like this. You're courting disaster. Geraldine tried to regain control. She raised her hands. Everyone, please. I understand the concerns, but this project has been thoroughly researched. The benefits outweigh the challenges. Cornell let out a short laugh, not mocking but sharp. You call trespassing challenges? You've built your dream runway on stolen ground, and you think paperwork will protect you. But trust me, it won't fly. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Geraldine's face flushed. Are you threatening the board, Mr. Braxton? Cornell didn't blink. No. I'm telling you a fact. There's a difference. The meeting dissolved into noise, neighbors arguing, board members whispering to each other, and Geraldine pounding the gavel in a futile attempt to restore order. But the damage was done. The community had seen the lines drawn in plain sight. The HOA's arrogance on one side and Cornell's quiet resolve on the other. But if Geraldine thought she could steamroll him into submission, she hadn't yet realized that Cornell's reach stretched far beyond the borders of Maplewood Lakes. The days following the HOA meeting were thick with tension. What should have been an ordinary week in Maplewood Lakes instead felt like a standoff. Neighbors avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Conversations hushed when someone from the board walked into the grocery store. And at the local diner off Highway 98, the Braxton farm was all anyone could talk about between sips of sweet tea and bites of fried catfish. Cornell kept his focus on the farm. He rose at dawn, worked the fields, checked the irrigation, and fixed what needed fixing. From the outside, nothing had changed. But Rosalind noticed the way his shoulders carried more weight, the way he stared a little longer at the horizon when the machines across the property line growled back to life. One afternoon, as he loaded hay bales onto a trailer, a neighbor pulled up in a dusty pickup. Wesley Grant, a mechanic who had lived 2 roads over for years, stepped out and tipped his hat. "Cornell," he called, voice low. "Mind if I have a word?" Cornell set the bale down and wiped his hands. "Go ahead." Wesley looked around as if making sure no one else could hear. "I don't like what Geraldine's doing." "None of us do. But folks are scared. She's been telling people if you fight this, you'll drag the whole neighborhood into lawsuits. Said property values will tank, banks will pull out. People believe her." Cornell studied him carefully. "And what do you believe?" "I believe land is land. Yours is yours. Don't take a man's soil unless you're ready to answer for it." "But I've got kids, Cornell. If this turns into lawyers and court fees, I can't afford to be caught in the middle." Cornell nodded slowly. "I hear you. Nobody should have to pick between right and ruin. That's on her, not you." Wesley's jaw tightened. "Just watch your back. Geraldine's not the type to back down. She'll double down that evening." Geraldine did exactly that. She sent out a newsletter, glossy and well-worded, delivered to every household in Maplewood Lakes. It praised the benefits of the runway, promising economic growth, exclusivity, and a modern future for the community. The section about the Braxton farm was written in cold, legalistic language. The land in question is under Maplewood Lake's jurisdiction and has been misused for decades. Current occupants have no rightful claim. When Rosalind read the letter at her kitchen table, her hands trembled with rage. Misused, she shouted, slamming the paper down. Your daddy bled into that soil, Cornell. Misused. They wouldn't know hard work if it bit them. Cornell read the letter without flinching. His silence said more than any outburst could. He folded it neatly and set it aside. Patrice, who had just come in from school, looked between them. This is what they're doing, Cornell. They're controlling the story. If people believe their version, you'll look like the troublemaker. Cornell leaned back in his chair. That's why patience matters. Let them talk. Let them lie. Every move they make digs their hole deeper. Eventually, they'll bury themselves. But while Cornell was calm, not everyone shared his patience. At the next Sunday service at St. Mark's Church, the air was thick with whispers before the choir even sang the opening hymn. Afterward, in the parking lot, Geraldine approached a group of congregants with her polished smile. We should pray for Mr. Braxton, she said sweetly, loud enough for Cornell's niece to overhear. Change is hard for some people, but progress doesn't wait for sentimentality. That remark spread like wildfire. By Monday morning, Cornell was hearing secondhand how Geraldine had painted him as stubborn, outdated, and selfish. Worse yet, the board filed paperwork at the county registrar's office, attempting to formalize their claim over the disputed acres. The registrar, an older clerk named Edna Wilcox, called Cornell personally. Mr. Braxton, I can't stop them from filing, but I thought you should know. They're trying to push this through fast. Thank you, Edna, Cornell said. I'll handle it. That night, Cornell sat on the porch with Patrice, the cicadas droning in the background. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. They think this is about land. They don't realize it's about legacy. They think paperwork wins. They don't realize the law runs deeper than any HOA vote. Patrice touched his arm. Then show them. Don't wait too long. Cornell's eyes stayed fixed on the dark silhouette of his fields. Timing is everything. And Geraldine hasn't yet learned who she's really dealing with. The next morning, heavy machinery rolled closer to the Braxton property line. Crews staked markers, preparing to cut a permanent scar into the earth. Neighbors watched from porches and driveways, torn between fear of Geraldine's power and quiet sympathy for Cornell. But the moment was coming when silence wouldn't be enough. And Cornell knew he would have to draw a line so sharp that no one in Maplewood Lakes could ignore it. By Tuesday morning, the rumble of engines grew louder. Construction crews moved closer to the Braxton property, pounding fresh stakes into the soil like a warning shot. Cornell had said little since the HOA meeting, but his silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. And now, he was ready. As the sun climbed, Rosalind stormed into the yard, waving another letter from the HOA. Cornell, they're threatening fines now. Can you believe that? Fines. For obstructing their project on your own land. Cornell took the paper, read it slowly, and folded it in half. Then it's time they hear me plain. He called Franklin Yates from his D.C. office, his tone calm but deliberate. Franklin, I may need documentation from the FAA. Guidelines on private airstrips, approvals, permits, everything they'd never think twice about. Franklin hesitated. Cornell, is this personal? It's legal, Cornell said. And it's about to get public. By late afternoon, word spread that Cornell had requested to attend the next HOA board session, not as a bystander this time, but to speak formally on the record. The clubhouse filled beyond capacity, neighbors shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the confrontation they knew was coming. Inside, Geraldine sat at the head of the long table, flanked by board members. She wore another sharp suit, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She banged the gavel once. Meeting is in session. Cornell stood from the audience and walked to the front. No notes, no papers. Just his presence. He faced Geraldine directly. You've trespassed on my family's farm. You've sent crews onto land that doesn't belong to you. And now you've threatened fines. Let me make myself clear. That land is legally mine, documented and recorded. Your claim is false. Geraldine smiled thinly. Mr. Braxton, we've reviewed the records. The land was absorbed into Maplewood Lakes' jurisdiction years ago. Our decision stands. Cornell leaned forward, his voice steady, his words echoing in the packed room. You keep talking about records. Then maybe you should know who keeps the records that matter. I'm Cornell Braxton, Director of the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'm telling you now, no runway gets built in this country without my signature. Certainly not on stolen land. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors turned to one another, whispering. Travis Merriman shifted uncomfortably in his chair, looking at Geraldine as though waiting for her next move. Geraldine froze for the briefest second, then recovered with a strained laugh. That's quite a claim, Mr. Braxton. Surely you wouldn't use your federal position to interfere in a community project. Cornell didn't flinch. Interfere? Number. Enforce. Absolutely. You can dream about your runway all you want, Geraldine, but without FAA approval, your strip of asphalt will be nothing more than an illegal hazard. And the penalties for operating without clearance are not something you're prepared to handle. The room buzzed with anxious energy. Joanne Field stood from the audience, her voice ringing out. You see, Geraldine, you've been bullying everyone into thinking you had the power. But you don't. You picked a fight with the wrong man. Howard Greer tapped his cane against the floor. I told you this would backfire. You can't steal a man's land and expect him to roll over. Geraldine's face flushed, but she forced a smile. Neighbors, don't be swayed by theatrics. This is about progress. Cornell straightened. No, this is about arrogance. You thought the rules didn't apply to you, but rules apply to everyone, whether you're a farmer, a neighbor, or a board president. And Geraldine, you've crossed the line. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the shifting of feet and the occasional cough. Even board member Evelyn Rhodes leaned forward, whispering urgently to Geraldine, we need to reconsider. This isn't worth it. But Geraldine wasn't ready to surrender. Her pride held her in place. We'll consult legal counsel, she said stiffly. This matter isn't finished. Cornell nodded once. Then I'll see you in court, and in Washington. With that, he turned and walked out, his shoulders broad and unshaken. The crowd parted as he passed, some patting his arm in quiet solidarity, others simply staring in awe. Outside, Rosalind hurried to his side. Cornell, you just put the fear of God in that woman. Cornell allowed himself the faintest smile. Sometimes the truth does the work for you. Still, Patrice's words from earlier echoed in his mind. This wasn't over. Geraldine wouldn't back down easily. And if she doubled down, the fight could drag the whole neighborhood through the mud. But Cornell had drawn his line, and now it was Geraldine's move, one that could decide whether Maplewood Lakes descended into chaos or finally faced accountability. The fallout from Cornell's revelation spread through Maplewood Lakes like wildfire. By Wednesday morning, every porch, every front yard conversation, and every text thread in the neighborhood revolved around one question. What happens now? For families who had moved into the community chasing stability, the sudden storm was suffocating. Property values, lawsuits, federal oversight, these weren't the things they signed up for when they bought into a tidy subdivision with a pond and a clubhouse. And yet here they were, caught between a determined landowner and an HOA president whose pride seemed more important than compromise. At the corner lot, Angela Rowe, a single mother raising 2 kids, vented to her neighbor. I don't care about no runway. I barely make my mortgage as it is. Geraldine's talking about lawyers, and lawyers mean money. Who do you think is going to pay for it? Us. Her neighbor Clint Peterson shook his head. She's playing with fire. Cornell's got the law and the FAA on his side. She's dragging us into a fight we can't win. Inside the clubhouse, Geraldine held a private strategy session with the board. The blinds were closed, the air heavy with tension. Travis Merriman spoke first, his voice uneasy. Geraldine, you heard him. He's the FAA director. He doesn't just have influence, he has authority. If he says no runway, there is no runway. Period. Geraldine's jaw tightened. Travis, you think I'm afraid of titles? He's bluffing. He won't risk using federal power for personal matters. We keep going. Evelyn Rhodes leaned forward, folding her hands tightly. But what about the neighbors? They're turning against us. I've gotten 6 emails today alone, demanding we halt the project. People are scared, Geraldine snapped, her voice sharp. Fear is temporary. Progress is permanent. Once the runway is finished, they'll thank us. But outside those closed doors, the community's patience was thinning. That evening, several families gathered on the Braxton property to speak directly with Cornell. They weren't there to fan the flames, they were there to find clarity. Angela Rowe was the first to step forward. Mr. Braxton, we don't want no trouble. But this mess is getting bigger every day. What happens to us if this goes to court? Cornell set aside the tools he'd been using to repair a fence post and gave her his full attention. His voice was steady, not rehearsed. Angela, you didn't start this fight. Neither did your neighbors. Geraldine forced it by crossing a line. I'm not here to hurt you or anyone else. I'm here to protect what's mine. And the truth is the law is on my side. If it goes to court, she'll lose, not you. Wesley Grant chimed in, scratching his beard. But she's making it sound like we're all liable. Like the HOA can bleed us for legal fees. Cornell nodded. That's her tactic. Scare people into silence. But HOA boards aren't above the law. She doesn't have the authority to drag this whole community into bankruptcy over her vanity project. And if she tries, she'll answer for that, too. The group murmured among themselves, some visibly relieved, others still anxious. A teenager standing beside his father spoke up timidly. Mr. Braxton, why don't you just use your job to stop her now? Wouldn't that be faster? Cornell crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. Because, son, power isn't meant to be abused. If I swing my authority like a hammer every time I'm angry, I'm no better than the ones who take what isn't theirs. Sometimes the lesson has to come the hard way. It lasts longer that way. The boy nodded, his father patting his shoulder. As the families left, Patrice joined Cornell by the fence. You gave them calm. That's what they needed. Cornell exhaled. They deserve calm. But Geraldine won't stop. She'll keep pushing until she breaks something. He was right. The very next day, Geraldine escalated again. She sent out a letter declaring that anyone supporting Cornell was obstructing community progress, and warned that non-compliance with HOA directives could result in fines or legal action. The language was threatening, designed to divide neighbor against neighbor. It backfired. At the local diner that evening, groups of residents openly criticized the board's tactics. Joanne Fields slammed the letter on the counter. Who does she think she is? I didn't move here to bankroll her pet project. If she thinks she can bully the Braxtons and scare the rest of us, she's lost her grip. Even Travis, once Geraldine's ally, was seen outside the clubhouse talking quietly with Evelyn. We're losing the neighborhood, he muttered. She's going too far. People don't trust us anymore. The once pristine image of Maplewood Lakes was cracking. Lawn parties turned into whispered strategy sessions. Sunday greetings turned into tense silences. The HOA, once the face of order, was now the cause of chaos. And through it all, Cornell stayed steady, letting Geraldine's arrogance do the damage for him. But storms don't build forever without breaking. And Cornell knew the breaking point was coming soon. And when it hit, no one in Maplewood Lakes would come out untouched. By now, Geraldine Klein had lost the casual support of most of her neighbors, but she refused to show weakness. Pride had hardened into stubbornness, and the more people questioned her, the more determined she became to prove them wrong. On Thursday evening, she called a closed-door session with her inner circle at the clubhouse. Heavy drapes shut out the summer sun, and the long oak table was covered in maps, blueprints, and thick folders of legal documents. This is about control, Geraldine declared, tapping her manicured nail against the blueprint of the proposed runway. If we back down now, Maplewood Lakes becomes a laughingstock. We set the tone for this neighborhood, and no one, not even Cornell Braxton, dictates terms to us. Travis Merriman shifted uncomfortably. But he's not just anyone. He's the FAA director. He doesn't even need a courtroom to stop this. All it takes is a single memo from his office, Geraldine scoffed. He wouldn't dare. That would be abuse of power. And he knows it. He's bluffing. He's trying to scare us into retreat. Evelyn Rhodes spoke up quietly. What if he's not bluffing? What if he's just waiting for us to overreach? The neighbors are already turning against us. You're giving him ammunition. Geraldine leaned back. her pearl necklace catching the light. Then let him come. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I won't be remembered as the president who caved to intimidation. While she was posturing behind closed doors, Cornell was in Washington finishing up a long day at FAA headquarters. He sat at his desk overlooking the Capitol, a stack of reports in front of him. Franklin Yates stepped in, holding a folder. "Sir, I pulled the documents you asked for." Franklin said, "FAA protocols, environmental requirements, zoning restrictions for private runways. It's ironclad. No one in their right mind could bypass these." Cornell flipped through the papers slowly. "Good. Because I want her to see the wall she's running into before she smashes her head against it." Franklin hesitated. "Do you want me to start a formal investigation?" Cornell shook his head. "Not yet. This has to play out locally first. If I step in too soon, it'll look like I used my badge to fight a personal battle. But once she crosses into federal territory, that's when she'll find out just how small her world really is." The following weekend, Geraldine staged a community rally on the proposed runway site. She brought out folding chairs, banners, and even catered snacks. A handful of loyalists clapped along as she boasted about the future of Maplewood Lakes, but the turnout was thinner than she expected. Many neighbors showed up only to watch quietly from the sidelines. Cornell arrived late, driving his old pickup onto the edge of the field. He stepped out and walked straight toward the small crowd. Conversations hushed as he approached. Geraldine stiffened, but forced a smile. "Mr. Braxton," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm glad you came. Maybe you'll finally see that the community supports this project." Cornell scanned the crowd. Dozens of uneasy faces, some looking at the ground, others staring at him with hope in their eyes. He spoke plainly, his voice steady. "Support? I see neighbors afraid of being fined, afraid of being bullied into silence. That's not support, Geraldine. That's intimidation." Murmurs rippled through the group. Geraldine raised her chin. "You can accuse me all you want, but the board's authority is clear. We have the votes. We have the plan." Cornell pulled a document from the folder under his arm. "And I have the law. Federal law. Without FAA approval, your runway is nothing more than asphalt on dirt. And let me assure you, approval will never come." Gasps filled the air. Geraldine's smile faltered, but she pressed forward. "You wouldn't dare use your office to stop us? That's corruption." Cornell stepped closer, his voice low but sharp enough for everyone to hear. "Corruption is when you steal land you don't own. Corruption is when you threaten families with fines to scare them into silence. Don't talk to me about corruption, Geraldine. I know it when I see it." For the first time, Geraldine's mask cracked. Her cheeks flushed red, her composure slipping. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some nodding at Cornell's words, others pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Travis finally spoke, unable to sit still any longer. "Geraldine, he's right. We can't keep pushing this. We'll destroy ourselves. This isn't leadership, it's ego." Evelyn looked out at the crowd, her voice trembling but firm. "Maybe it's time we listen instead of bulldoze." Geraldine's hands clenched at her sides, but she had no answer. Cornell let the silence hang for a moment before turning back to his truck. He had said enough. The neighbors could decide what kind of community they wanted to live in. As he drove away, Rosalind called him on his cell. "Cornell, you just cut her down in front of everyone." Cornell replied calmly. "No, Rosalind. She cut herself down. All I did was hold up the mirror." But pride doesn't die quietly, and Geraldine wasn't finished yet. She was about to push the fight into dangerous territory where the stakes would climb even higher. By the next week, Maplewood Lakes no longer felt like a suburban refuge. The once pristine lawns and cheerful morning waves had been replaced with sharp glares, hushed arguments, and tension that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. People avoided eye contact at the mailbox, unsure which side of the runway fight their neighbors stood on. Geraldine, though publicly humiliated at the rally, doubled down in private. She hired an attorney from Durham, a slick man named Victor Langley, known for dragging disputes into courtrooms until the other side bled dry. She told the board during a tense Thursday night meeting, "If Braxton thinks he can scare us, he's wrong. We'll bury him in paperwork. We'll make the fight so expensive he won't last." Travis rubbed his temples, exasperated. Geraldine, you don't understand. He's not just another farmer. He's got Washington behind him. If this goes federal, you'll drag every single one of us into the fire. People are already furious. Then they can be furious. Geraldine snapped. Progress always upsets the small-minded. While she was sharpening her legal weapons, Cornell was back home on the farm, seated on the porch with Patrice. His phone buzzed with calls from journalists who had caught wind of the conflict. Word had leaked that the FAA director himself was in a land dispute with his own HOA, and the story was too tempting for the press to resist. Patrice watched him ignore yet another call. You can't keep dodging them forever, she said gently. Cornell sighed. The more I talk, the more fuel they get. I don't want this turning into a circus. But it already is, Patrice countered. Geraldine's painting you as some tyrant who's holding the community hostage. If you don't speak, her version becomes the only version people hear. Cornell leaned back, eyes on the fading sun. Maybe it's time they hear me on the record. That Sunday evening, Cornell agreed to sit down with a local news station. Cameras rolled as he stood in front of his family's barn, arms crossed, speaking directly into the lens. This land has belonged to my family for 3 generations. It is not community property, it is not for sale, and it is certainly not for the Maplewood Lakes HOA to claim. The law is clear, and as director of the FAA, I can assure you, this so-called runway will never operate legally. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The segment aired across North Carolina that night, and by Monday morning, it was circulating nationally. Commentators on talk radio debated whether an HOA had any right to seize farmland. Editorials slammed Geraldine's arrogance, while others marveled at the irony of an FAA director fighting a runway in his own backyard. The attention rattled the community. Some neighbors feared property values would sink under the glare of controversy. Others felt emboldened, proud that Cornell had stood his ground. For the first time, Geraldine's carefully constructed control began to crack. At a hastily called emergency meeting, residents packed into the clubhouse demanding answers. Joanne Field stood up, her voice ringing. Geraldine, you've humiliated this neighborhood. We're in the papers, on the news. This isn't progress, it's a disaster. Howard Greer pointed his cane toward the board. You promised us growth. All you've delivered is shame. You've turned Maplewood Lakes into a national joke. Geraldine slammed the gavel, trying to restore order. Enough. This is temporary. Once the runway is complete, the benefits will outweigh the noise. Cornell, seated calmly in the back, rose to his feet. His voice cut through the chaos. Runway? You're not building a runway, Geraldine. You're building a liability. And the FAA doesn't authorize liabilities. Victor Langley, her attorney, stood. Mr. Braxton, you may be the FAA director, but you're still a private landowner here. You can't use your position to interfere with community development. Cornell faced him squarely. You're right. I can't use my office for personal gain, but I can enforce federal aviation law. And I will. The room erupted, neighbors clapping, shouting, arguing. Some stormed out, others demanded Geraldine resign immediately. The board was fractured, half terrified of lawsuits, half too stubborn to admit defeat. Later that night, Geraldine drove through the neighborhood in silence, headlights cutting through the dark. For the first time, doubt seeped into her confidence. Her allies were wavering. Her reputation was in tatters. And the man she'd underestimated had national attention on his side. Back at the farm, Cornell sat with Rosalind and Patrice on the porch. The night air was thick, the cicadas loud. Rosalind turned to him. You've pushed her into a corner. What do you think she'll do? Cornell took a long sip of sweet tea before answering. A cornered ego is the most dangerous kind. She'll lash out before she admits she's wrong. But neither Rosalind nor Patrice knew just how far Geraldine was willing to go, and the next move she made would shake Maplewood Lakes to its core. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected. By midweek, Geraldine's grip on the community had crumbled. Families who once followed her lead now avoided her altogether. At the playground, parents whispered about moving out. At the diner, residents signed a petition demanding her resignation. Even Evelyn Rhodes, once her most loyal ally, privately told neighbors she was done being dragged through the mud. Still, Geraldine refused to admit defeat. On Wednesday morning, heavy trucks rolled once again toward the Braxton farm. She'd ordered the contractor to begin laying gravel, even without final approval. The roar of machinery thundered across the fields, but this time, neighbors weren't silent spectators. They gathered at the edge of Cornell's property, angry and determined. Some carried signs reading, "Respect the Braxtons," and "No runway on stolen land." Cornell stepped out of his farmhouse, calm as ever, and walked directly toward the machines. He raised his hand. "Shut it down." The foreman hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. "Mr. Braxton, I've got instructions from the HOA." Cornell cut him off, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "And I've got a federal injunction. Effective today, any further construction here is illegal under FAA law. You keep those machines running, and you'll answer to Washington, not Maplewood Lakes." The foreman froze, staring at the paper, then at Cornell's steady eyes. Slowly he waved his arm, and one by one the machines shut down. Silence spread over the field. Gasps and cheers broke out among the neighbors watching. Angela Rowe clapped her hands, tears in her eyes. "Finally!" she shouted. Geraldine's black SUV screeched to a halt nearby. She stormed out, fury etched into every line of her face. "You think you've won, Cornell? You think this piece of paper scares me?" Cornell met her anger with quiet strength. "It's not about fear, Geraldine. It's about law. And you've broken it. You're abusing your power." She snapped. "No," he replied firmly. "I'm defending my family. And I'm defending every neighbor you tried to bully. That's the difference." The crowd erupted again, this time chanting for Geraldine to step down. Her voice shook as she tried to shout over them, but no one was listening anymore. Travis Merriman and Evelyn Rhodes approached her, faces pale. "Geraldine," Evelyn whispered urgently, "it's over. If we keep pushing, we'll bankrupt ourselves. The community's against us." "The board's finished," Travis added. "You wanted a legacy. Well, this is it. You'll be remembered for tearing this neighborhood apart." For once, Geraldine had no retort. She looked around at the angry faces, at the machines sitting idle, at Cornell standing firm with the law on his side. Pride had carried her this far, but now it left her stranded. Without another word, she turned back toward her SUV and slammed the door shut. Gravel spat from the tires as she sped away. The following week, the HOA board dissolved under mounting pressure. Geraldine resigned as president, and Victor Langley quietly withdrew as counsel when it became clear the case had no merit. County officials confirmed the Braxton Farm's ownership records were ironclad. The attempted seizure had been illegal from the start. Neighbors breathed a collective sigh of relief. At the diner, talk finally shifted away from lawsuits and back to everyday life. Kids played freely in yards again, and Sunday service at St. Mark's was filled with gratitude instead of gossip. For Cornell, the victory wasn't about headlines or authority. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he walked the fields with Anthony by his side. The soil still bore the scars of machinery, but it was theirs, untouched and unbroken. Anthony broke the silence. "Dad, you could have crushed her from the beginning. Why'd you wait?" Cornell paused, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because sometimes the hardest lesson isn't the one you teach, it's the one people teach themselves." Geraldine needed to fall by her own hand. That way, everyone could see what arrogance does. Anthony nodded, finally understanding. Rosalind joined them, brushing her hands against the tall grass. "Your daddy's right. The land stood through storms before. It'll stand through this one, too." Cornell smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This land isn't just soil. It's legacy, and legacy doesn't bend to greed." But even as peace settled back over Maplewood Lakes, the story carried a lesson far beyond the community, one about power, humility, and the cost of forgetting that respect is stronger than pride. Life in Maplewood Lakes slowly found its balance again, but the scars of the fight lingered like tracks in freshly tilled soil. Some residents felt embarrassed by how close they had come to losing themselves in Geraldine's vision. Others felt humbled, realizing they had allowed fear of property values and social standing to blind them to what was right. And for Cornell Braxton, the outcome confirmed what he had always known: patience, dignity, and truth outlast arrogance every time. Weeks after Geraldine's resignation, a community gathering was held, not in the clubhouse that had once been her stage, but at St. Mark's Church. The pews were full, neighbors sitting side by side without the thick tension that had once divided them. At the front, the new interim board spoke briefly about rebuilding trust, then stepped aside to let Cornell say a few words. He walked up slowly, no papers in his hand, no official titles hanging around his neck. Just a man in a simple shirt, his cap tucked under his arm. He looked out over the faces of the people who had lived through the storm with him. Families, retirees, children sitting on laps. And he began. "This fight was never about me," he said. "And it wasn't just about land. It was about respect. Respect for history, respect for hard work, respect for your neighbors. Somewhere along the way that respect got lost. And when it's lost, we all pay the price." He paused, letting the words settle. "You saw what happened when pride and power tried to take something that didn't belong to them. It tore us apart. It brought lawyers, cameras, shame. But in the end, it taught us something we needed to remember. Progress without respect isn't progress. It's destruction." Angela Rowe, seated near the front, nodded slowly. Howard Greer leaned on his cane, his weathered face showing both exhaustion and relief. Even Travis Merriman, who had once sat loyally beside Geraldine, stared at the floor, the weight of his silence heavy. Cornell continued. "I could have used my position to end this quickly, but I didn't. Because if I had, you might never have seen the truth for yourselves. Geraldine wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting every one of you. She believed power made her untouchable. But she forgot that communities don't survive on power. They survive on respect, humility, and accountability." Patrice, sitting with Rosalind in the second row, felt tears sting her eyes. She knew this wasn't just about Maplewood Lakes. Cornell was speaking to something deeper, something every community, every family, every person needed to hear. "I hope," Cornell said, his voice steady, "that when the next test comes, and it will, you'll remember what happened here. Don't let fear or greed blind you. Don't let pride make you forget who you are. Stand on truth, even when it costs you something, because the cost of silence is always greater." The church was silent, save for the creak of the wooden pews as people shifted uncomfortably. Then, slowly, applause began. Not loud or rushed, but steady and growing, until the room was filled with it. Cornell nodded once, then stepped down, returning to his seat beside Patrice. Outside, as neighbors lingered in the churchyard, conversations felt lighter. Children chased each other across the grass, and for the first time in months, laughter carried through the air. The Braxton farm, visible in the distance, stood as a reminder of what had been fought for. Not just land, but legacy. Later that evening, sitting on his porch, Cornell reflected quietly with Patrice. Fireflies danced in the fading light. "You think they'll remember?" Patrice asked softly. "They'll remember," Cornell said. "People always remember when pride costs them. And if they don't, well, history has a way of teaching the same lesson twice." Patrice smiled faintly. "And you? What did you learn?" Cornell leaned back, his gaze sweeping across the fields. "That sometimes the hardest battles aren't in Washington or in a courtroom. They're in your own backyard. And if you can win those with patience and dignity, you can win anything." The farm was quiet, the soil safe again. But the lesson would live far beyond Maplewood Lakes. Because in the end, the story wasn't just about a man protecting his land. It was about what happens when arrogance collides with truth, when privilege is forced to face accountability, and when neighbors realize that real progress isn't built on runways, it's built on respect. If this story spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe for more. These stories remind us that the strongest legacies are not built on power, but on principle.